Peter chapter 2. It's toward the end of your Bible. It is after the book of Hebrews and after the book of James. We've been in Peter now for about 4 or 5 weeks as we walk through. And I'll give you some recap as we kind of go through things here. We're going to be looking at verses 11 through 17. The title of the message is called Silenced. It was October of 2016, and maybe you've seen this even in the news, when Pastor Andrew Brunson was arrested in Turkey. He was held with 21 others in a cell that was originally only designed to hold 8 prisoners. Over the course of his time in prison, he lost over 50 pounds. And finally, in July of 2018, he was moved to house arrest. Pastor Brunson is not Turkish. He is an American citizen who grew up in South Carolina. He was a missionary to Turkey, where he served as a pastor of a small congregation. And as he went forward in this country that is now primarily Muslim, seeking to spread the good news of the gospel. But in 2016, there was a coup in Turkey. It failed, but some of the local folks where Pastor Andrew was serving decided that this would be a good opportunity to try to implicate Pastor Andrew as knowing some people that were a part of this coup and maybe having something to do with it because they didn't like that he was spreading the gospel in their town. And so false charges were brought against him, and he ended up spending 2 years in prison and underwent 4 different trials over the long run. In 3 of those trials, a number of false witnesses came forward giving false testimony against him, saying that he had some links to some of those people that were involved in this coup. Brunson said, in the midst of these trials, gave testimony to the gospel, but also gave forgiveness to those who spoke falsely against him, saying, "My faith teaches me to forgive, so I forgive those who have testified against me." Another American pastor who was present at the trials said of one of the trials, "As usual, there was much spurious testimony against Andrew. His testimony, though, was absolutely powerful. He presented the gospel with confidence and defended himself with boldness." Andrew's wife, Noreen, who was originally arrested but let go after about a week, commented, she said, "The Lord was absolutely glorified. Andrew explained why he was there. He gave the gospel. He publicly forgave all those who have come against him, forgiving even as he has been forgiven." You know, it reminds me of back in the early church where Peter and Paul are told, don't worry, because when you're arrested, you'll be brought before significant people and you'll be able to share the gospel. This kind of thing is still happening today. Noreen went on to say about Andrew as she had met with him and shared some of his testimony. He said, "It is a privilege to suffer for the sake of Christ. Blessed am I as I suffer for him. Blessed am I as I am slandered. Blessed am I as I am being lied about. Blessed am I as I'm imprisoned. Blessed am I as I share in his suffering." She went on to say, "I'm incredibly proud of him, as I'm quite sure that he's not feeling all those blessings at this present point." A final hearing was underwent on October 12th, 2018, just recently, after this finally was brought out into the open and received some significant coverage worldwide. Several witnesses who had been testifying at the previous trials suddenly retracted their statements. And as a result, Pastor Andrew was released. Today, as we look at the Apostle Peter and we go back and we remember that he's writing to Christians in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. So the same region, but 2,000 years before, the same kinds of things were going on. And the folks there experiencing discrimination and persecution has begun to break out. Peter himself is in Rome under Nero, the one who began persecuting Christians, and now it is beginning to spread. Peter and Paul themselves will be put to death under Nero's reign in Rome within 2 to 4 years of Peter writing this letter. We know that wherever there is power, there is also corruption. Some say that some of what Peter says in this passage is a bit baffling, actually, especially from someone who lives under Nero's reign. But Peter isn't so interested in critiquing the secular government. He's much more interested in our character as a church in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. So today we hear his instruction to those who are being treated unjustly. And we pick up in chapter 2, verses 11 through 17. Dear friends, I urge you as alien and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves, for the Lord's sake, to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king. The word of the Lord. Now, Peter is writing to some folks, and even as you listen, you kind of hear some baffling things that Peter is saying. These are Christians in Asia Minor who are being mistreated, even by government officials. People are making all kinds of false reports about them. I've mentioned them as we've gone through this. They've been what sounds strange to us, but they're being called atheists. But remember, 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome and in that world, that most people believed in many gods. And if you didn't worship those gods, then you didn't believe in the gods, and therefore you're atheists. They were also saying that the Christians were incestuous because they called each other brother and sister and told each other that they loved one another. And so they took this and used propaganda to say they must be having inappropriate relationships with each other, trying to turn people against them. They also said that they were cannibalistic, that in their secret meetings that they ate flesh and blood of human beings. Of course, these are just propaganda stories that have to do with communion, right? That we eat the flesh of Christ, the bread, and we drink the blood of Christ, the wine. From chapters 1 to 2:10, which we've gone over the last few weeks, Peter is reminding these Christians of their true identity, that they're still growing into, they're still coming to grasp. He says, you're a holy people of God. You're not what other people are saying about you. You're a covenant people. I like that word, covenant, for some reason. You're a kingdom of priests. You're a chosen people. You're the new temple. God resides with you wherever you are. It's in you that people come to know God and to meet with God, just like it used to be in the temple in Jerusalem that people would come and meet with God. Now they meet God in and through you. You are the temple of God. And understanding and embracing this new identity is quite critical. In chapter 2, verse 1 that we looked at last week, Peter says it's critical for you to know who you are, and it's critical for you to know who you no longer are. And he says in verse 1, therefore rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, all hypocrisy, all envy, and slander of every kind. These are rather broad concepts, but as we move on into the book, Peter's going to get more specific. He's going to narrow down what it looks like for these Christians living in this specific situation. And in verse 11, Peter returns to and reminds us of our alien status here in this world. And he tells us that our primary citizenship is in the kingdom of God. But we presently reside as strangers in this world. I think this is really important for us today in the 21st century as Christians to realize we are not of this world. We have a different citizenship. We have a bigger kingdom that we're a part of. For Peter, it's essential to embrace this part of our identity. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves acting like this world, warring over the things that this world wars over. We'll find ourselves identifying not primarily as Christians, but maybe as Republicans, disliking Democrats, slandering them, accusing them because of whatever the news media tells us that we take to be true. Or on the other side, we'll find ourselves identifying as being, well, I'm a Democrat, and I'm going to be fixed. And all my time and my thoughts are going to go toward trying to reclaim and regain power, or trying to impeach a Republican president as though that somehow is going to make society better again, which of course we know it won't. There are a lot of problems with the government in the first century AD as well. Nero was arguably insane. But Peter isn't focused on changing the institution. He wants us to be focused on changing who we are and how we live in whatever circumstances we happen to find ourselves. It reminds me of a saying by Rumi, who was a poet many hundreds of years ago. He said, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I'm changing myself." This is Peter's focus, but he lets us in on a secret, a little-known secret that I think we even tend to forget today, that when we begin with change in ourselves, that change in ourselves brings change in the world around us. In verse 11, Peter says, our first response to being mistreated is to abstain from sinful desires. Now remember the context here, right? Don't jump to all these little issues that are things that we have to deal with as far as sin issues, but what would sin look like for this particular group of people under this particular group circumstances? Probably anger and retaliation, right? Probably slandering back. That's typical for human beings when they're in these situations. I'm not this, but this is what you are. We see it in the news all the time. He says, abstain from these sinful desires. Why do we want to abstain from the sinful desire? In this case, probably retaliation, defending ourselves, finger pointing. Because, he says, they wage war against our souls. And that's something to stop to consider. So someone's done you wrong. Yeah, you can choose to hold on to bitterness. You can choose to hold on to resentment. You can choose to hold on to unforgiveness. But you're mainly hurting yourself. A congregation member has shared the story a couple of times in Bible study where he said he was at work, and one day one of his fellow employees came to him and said, I really want to apologize because I've really been holding something against you for over a year now when you first came on. And I don't remember exactly what it was. And he said, and now that I get to know you, I see you're actually a really good and decent guy. And I've been angry with you and not liking you for over a year now. And this gentleman said, well, wow, thanks. He says, but it really didn't bother me much because I didn't even know you were angry. And then the point was, here was this guy so upset for over a year. And he said, and he was really only hurting himself. There's another saying that I like, and it's on this next slide. It says, to forgive is to set a prisoner free, and to discover the prisoner was you. Peter says, abstain from sinful desires. Why? Because they wage war against your soul. And he goes on to tell us to live good lives. See, people are gossiping and slandering against these Christians. And what does Peter say their response should be? Focus on living a good life. That's it. That's your response to this kind of behavior. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits. I don't really like that the NIV translates this as pagans because in our day and age, that's kind of a slander itself, isn't it? The actual Greek word there is ethnesin. And ethnesin is, as you might imagine, from where we get the word ethnicity. And so I think some other translations do a little better rather than doing pagans, which seems like a loaded word. It really just means those who worship many false gods and are of this world. It can also be translated the Gentiles or the nations. And he's saying, they're of this world, but you remember, you're not of this world. You're of a different kingdom. So Peter says, let them accuse you of doing wrong, so long as your good deeds make their accusations look a little silly. I was 18 years old, and I wasn't yet a Christian, but I like to think I was a fairly decent human being. And I was hanging out with some friends, and we had a little private party going on, and all of a sudden a couple of carloads of these guys show up, and they start causing trouble. And if I was a Christian, I probably would have handled it a little bit differently, but my dad was a Marine, and he told me, it doesn't matter if you win or lose. If you go down swinging. And so we got into a pretty bad fight. And there were ambulances involved, and there were stitches involved on both sides. And a few days later, I had a friend contact me because he had heard about it, and he was friends with me, but he was also friends with some people on the other group. And he said this. He said, I asked what had happened, and he said, well, Keith attacked me. And he said, no, Keith didn't attack you. He said, what'd you do? And I thought, I'm glad that I had the character enough that when this guy hears from someone who he likes that this is what happened, he can say, no, I know that Keith didn't start that. What did you do? I was glad, that made me feel good. And what made me feel better, I kind of went on with my life. This gentleman tried to press charges against me. I went on and later became a Christian, not as a result of this, but went to a discipleship program, and then I found myself about 2 years later in Michigan, where I relocated, and all of a sudden some checks started showing up in my mailbox. Apparently, he tried to prosecute me, and as they did the investigation, which I only went in for one part and gave my testimony, the state ended up prosecuting him instead. And I started receiving these checks in the mail, and I was dating Carla at the time. And she says, what are these checks from? I'm like, a couple of years ago, I got into this fight, and I guess he lost. And now I was getting these checks, which was really cool because I really needed the money. And what was even better is I got to take my girl out on a date on this guy's expense. Now, Peter is saying, don't fight back. I would have handled that situation differently today than I did back then. He says, it's a bigger win if you don't retaliate. Because you'll win over those who are watching, and you may even win over your enemy. I think that's one of the main things that has changed in my life, is that as a Christian, I want to win over my enemy rather than beat them. Verse 15 says, for it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Have you ever been in a disagreement with someone, and after exchanging words with them and going your separate ways, you find yourself replaying that conversation over again in your head, and all of a sudden all kinds of great one-liners come to you, and you're like, I wish I would have said this, or I should have said that, and you're almost kind of hoping for an opportunity to re-engage so you can use the stuff that you thought about. But Peter says, no. The better way is to choose silence and to choose instead to do what is good and right. Let your actions be your testimony. Let your actions speak for you. Live a quiet and peaceable life, and may this silent testimony ultimately silence the accuser. And then he goes on to say, one of the things that I find hard as being a very independent American person, submit yourself. Now, it's important to note a few things. First, remember Peter says, you're not of this world. You're not of this society. You belong to God. Your citizenship is in heaven. Verse 16, he says, live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. It's important to Peter that you know you're free. You aren't subject to the opinions of others. You don't work for Caesar. He's not your king. You are douloi of God, slaves, servants of God, which in this context in the first century means you belong to him. Jesus had said you can't serve two masters. A doulos can only have one master, and you belong to God alone. So Caesar and the secular government, they have no real authority over you. In fact, unstable Nero will end up taking his own life in 68 AD because his governors are chasing him down, trying to kill him. That's what the world turns toward. And Peter's saying, you live in a different society. You're embedded here, but you're from a different kingdom. Nonetheless, Peter says, this world has systems that are designed by God. And these systems are necessary and they're meant for good, even though evil men may make a mockery of God's intent. Verse 13 to 14, he says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as to the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. Wouldn't it be nice if it always worked that way? Now remember, Peter is not living in an ideal world. He knows that the governors aren't always commending those who do right and punishing just those who do wrong. He's already experiencing this himself. He's a minority, a Jewish Christian living in Rome under Nero, who has blamed the Christians for setting fire to Rome, even though it was likely Nero who did that. Persecution has begun breaking out against Christians. Nonetheless, Peter is telling us the power to change the world begins in the power of change first at work in our own lives. Within 300 years from Peter's writing, Asia Minor will become predominantly Christian. It'll become the nation that sends out Christians all over the world in order to spread the gospel. And that could only happen because of their witness and their testimony, which under persecution and doing good and what is right, eventually changed the minds of those around them. The place where Peter is crucified and buried in Rome, a place that used to be called the Vatican, under Roman authority, one of the 14 administrative districts of Rome, where Nero resided, will become the place where the church becomes established and sets up the government of the church. And it's still there today, in a place still called the Vatican, but operating on a much different level. There is power in our nonviolent witness when we choose what is good and right, rather than brute strength and retaliation. When we let our lives be the witness and the defense that God has given us, rather than our words or our tweets or whatever else we might place our trust in. When we entrust our lives to God rather than men. We are not of this world, but our Christ-like witness is the only thing that can change this world. And even as a church, when we lose that Christ-like witness, the world has no need to hear or listen anymore. So whether the world heeds our witness or not, one day, Peter says, they will know. Verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits. On the day he visits is when Christ returns. And that day is coming. It will be the greater reality than even what we're experiencing now. It's when God comes and he places a mirror before humanity that we might see ourselves. Hopefully, people will begin glorifying God before that day because our witness will awaken something within them. And then they'll be standing with all those who believe. But even if they don't, Peter says they will glorify God. Because on the day that he visits, they will know that they have no excuse. They will have to admit that we heard, we saw, but we chose to ignore. In conclusion, I want to end with a witness of a people called the Kogi. The Kogi are an ancient people who live in South America. They're the only indigenous civilization that survived the Spanish conquest in South and Central America. They had begun by living in the lowlands along the coastal areas of northern Colombia, which they had inhabited for 6 centuries before the Spanish conquistadors arrived. But when they saw the conquistadors coming and ravaging and overthrowing and killing, they decided that they'd head up into the high mountains, where they've lived for the last 500 years. Sierra Nevada rises 17,000 feet from the Caribbean coast. It's chilly, There are snow-capped peaks, which are 5,200 meters above sea level. And adapting to life in the mountains when you used to live in a nice, favorable climate along the coastlines was no easy task for the Kogi. But the Kogi had considered the mountains to be their sacred mother for many ages before they actually had to abandon themselves and where they were and go and live in those mountains. They believed that those mountains were the heart of the world. So when they found a new sanctuary within what they called their mother, they also discovered a new reason for their existence. The Kogi believed that their sacred call was to be caretakers of the earth. And so they started with caring for the mountain ranges in which they lived. And they believed that one day this mission would extend to the rest of the earth. And they continue to take that responsibility very seriously. Their whole life is built around meditation and sacred rituals designed to keep the earth in balance. They developed practical ways to live in harmony with the earth and the environment. And they refer to themselves as older brother. And they refer to those who came, those Spanish conquistadors and all those who came after them, as younger brother. And although they've lived in seclusion from modern civilization all this time, they've always been keen to keep an eye on younger brother and how he lives and what kind of impact that has on the world. They watched as younger brother destroyed the coastal wetlands and the shorelines. When younger brother began building hydroelectric dams, they took note. When younger brother began mining the lower parts of the mountains and polluting the air, they watched. When they began seeing that landslides were happening and floods and deforestation was taking place, and that there was a drying up of the lakes and the rivers, and the death of trees and vegetation was happening, they kept watching. And in 1990, they decided that they had to initiate with younger brother. It was alarmingly clear that he was destroying the earth. Younger brother seemed to forget that he was a part of the earth. They felt that their isolation was no longer defensible, and they needed to warn younger brother of the catastrophic future facing the planet if he didn't change his ways. The event in the early 1990s was documented by BBC, but the Kogi words went unheeded. In fact, scientists came in and refuted what the Kogi were saying, saying that there was no evidence, that it was ridiculous that the Kogi had this notion that what happens in the coastal lowlands somehow affects what happens up in the mountains, and that couldn't be possible. And the Kogi wondered how scientists, whose job was to study nature, to study how things interacted with each other, couldn't know what the Kogi could know intuitively and just by watching with their eyes. They wondered, how could younger brother not understand that earth is a living body, that when you do something in this area, it's going to affect that area over there, and that by damaging the body of the earth, you're also damaging human life. 23 years later, the Kogi summoned the filmmakers back to the area in order to renew their message, which now had a greater sense of urgency. They turned the project over to their spiritual leaders, who they called Kogi Mama. The Kogi Mama, or the enlightened ones, were actually spent their first years mostly in darkness in order to get them in tune, not only with what they see with their eyes or can touch with their hands, but to get in tune with the world around them, that they might depend on this greater sense that you can feel in your spirit. And then they underwent 18 years of training to become spiritual leaders. And the Kogi sent these spiritual leaders to teach the younger brother about the delicate interconnections which exist between everything in the natural world. The evidence was now all around them. The once white-capped peaks of the mountains were now brown and bare. The parched lakes and the dying trees were all around them. The urgent appeal to younger brother was that younger brother needs to respond to the needs of the earth in order to keep a balance. This time, the specialist outside the Kogi system said the Kogi are right. There was a specialist on ecosystems and restoration that came in. There was a specialist who was a professor of zoology who affirmed what they were saying. There was a specialist and a leader in marine biology who said, yes, this is having an impact. This time the documentary got major attention. You can still watch it on Netflix today. Sadly, though, the habitat of the kogi continues to be destroyed because humanity still seems to be serving another master. The master that Jesus warned us about, Mammon. But instead of responding with despair, the kogi have turned to tourism to get their message out. This is really hard for the kogi because they like living in seclusion. They like being able to live their way. But they decided that they needed to open up their villages to be able to have people from the outside come in. It's a 3-day journey. You can take it. And you can go on 3 days, hike up to where the kogi are, and begin seeing their way of life and learning from their teachers. And their desire and their hope is that, just like the early church, that as they teach, they'll send others out who will begin to spread that message to the rest of the world. The kogi, although they like living in seclusion, feel that it's not responsible and that they have to get out of their isolated system and begin interacting and engaging the world. For them, they feel that it's their calling to this world and in this world. It sounds really familiar to me, to what I read in the Bible about our own mission. As Christians, we too have a calling in and for the world. We serve as a witness, as a warning, and also as those extending an invitation. We're to witness, Peter says, primarily by the way we live our lives. We're to warn by speaking the truth in love. And the in love part of that is really key. And we're to invite others into the larger vision of the kingdom of God. And all of it must be done in respectful relationship. And the burden of respectful falls on us, not the world. Verse 17, show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king. Now, honor the king does not mean unquestioned obedience. Peter and Paul will refuse to renounce Christ. Peter and Paul will refuse not to spread the gospel. Peter and Paul will refuse not to meet together with other believers. And Nero will execute them for that refusal. But never do they mistreat or disrespect even Nero's position. Refusing to place others above God is not disrespectful. Treating them as less than human is. So though we may be laughed at or considered irrelevant in this world, may the goodness of our lives and the emerging revelation of the truth, which is revealed in it and through it, may this be the witness which silences the foolishness of the self-destructiveness of our world. And may we continue to pray, God's kingdom come, and may it begin with us. Let's pray.